The terror, which would not end for another 28 years, if it ever did end, began, so far as I know or can tell, with a boat made from a sheet of newspaper floating down a gutter swollen with rain. The boat bobbed, listed, righted itself again, dived bravely through treacherous whirlpools, and continued on its way down Witcham Street toward the traffic light, which marked the intersection of Witcham and Jackson. The three vertical lenses on all sides of the traffic light were dark this afternoon in the fall of 1957, and the houses were all dark, too. There had been steady rain for a week now, and 2 days ago the winds had come as well. Most sections of Derry had lost their power then, and it was not back on yet. A small boy in a yellow slicker and red galoshes ran cheerfully along beside the newspaper boat. The rain had not stopped, but it was finally slackening. It tapped on the yellow hood of the boy's slicker, sounding to his ears like rain on a shed roof. A comfortable, almost cozy sound. The boy in the yellow slicker was George Denbrough. He was 6. His brother, William, known to most of the kids at Derry Elementary School, and even to the teachers, who would never have used the nickname to his face, as Stuttering Bill, was at home, hacking out the last of a nasty case of influenza. In that autumn of 1957, 8 months before the real horrors began and 28 years before the final showdown, Stuttering Bill was 10 years old. Bill had made the boat beside which George now ran. He had made it sitting up in bed, his back propped against a pile of pillows, while their mother played for Elysian the piano in the parlor, and rain swept restlessly against his bedroom window. About 3/4 of the way down the block as one headed toward the intersection and the dead traffic light, Witcham Street was blocked to motor traffic by smudge pots and 4 orange sawhorses. Stenciled across each of the horses was Derry Dept of Public Works. Beyond them, the rain had spilled out of gutters clogged with branches and rocks and big sticky piles of autumn leaves. The water had first pried fingerholds in the paving and then snatched whole greedy handfuls. All of this by the 3rd day of the rains. By noon of the 4th day, big chunks of the street's surface were boating through the intersection of Jackson and Witcham like miniature whitewater rafts. By that time, many people in Derry had begun to make nervous jokes about arcs. The Public Works Department had managed to keep Jackson Street open, but Witcham was impassable from the sawhorses all the way to the center of town. But everyone agreed, the worst was over. The Kindeskeag stream had crested just below its banks in the barrens and barrenches below the concrete sides of the canal, which channeled it tightly as it passed through downtown. Right now a gang of men, Zach Denbrough, George's and Bill's father, among them, were removing the sandbags they had thrown up the day before with such panicky haste. Yesterday overflow and expensive flood damage had seemed almost inevitable. God knew it had happened before. The flooding in 1931 had been a disaster which had cost millions of dollars and almost 24 lives. That was a long time ago, but there were still enough people around who remembered it to scare the rest. One of the flood victims had been found 25 miles east, in Bucksport. The fish had eaten this unfortunate gentleman's eyes, 3 of his fingers, his penis, and most of his left foot. Clutched in what remained off his hands had been a Ford steering wheel. Now, though, the river was receding, and when the new Bangor Hydro Dam went in upstream, the river would cease to be a threat. Or so said Zach Denbrough, who worked for Bangor Hydroelectric. As for the rest, well, future floods could take care of themselves. The thing was to get through this one, to get the power back on, and then to forget it. In Derry, such forgetting of tragedy and disaster was almost an art, as Bill Denbrough would come to discover in the course of time. George paused just beyond the sawhorses at the edge of a deep ravine that had been cut through the tar surface of Witcham Street. This ravine ran on an almost exact diagonal. It ended on the far side of the street, roughly 40 feet farther down the hill from where he now stood, on the right. He laughed aloud, the sound of solitary, childish glee a bright runner in that gray afternoon, as a vagary of the flowing water took his paper boat into a scale model rapids which had been formed by the break in the tar. The urgent water had cut a channel which ran along the diagonal, and so his boat traveled from one side of Witcham Street to the other, the current carrying it so fast that George had to sprint to keep up with it. Water sprayed out from beneath his galoshes in muddy sheets. Their buckles made a jolly jingling as George Denbrough ran toward his strange death, and the feeling which filled him at that moment was clear and simple love for his brother Bill. love, and a touch of regret that Bill couldn't be here to see this and be a part of it. Of course, Say would try to describe it to Bill when he got home, but he knew he wouldn't be able to make Bill see it the way Bill would have been able to make him see it if their positions had been reversed. Bill was good at reading and writing, but even at Heisage, George was wise enough to know that wasn't the only reason why Bill got all A's on his report cards, or why his teachers liked his composition so well. Telling was only part of it. Bill was good at seeing. The boat nearly whistled along the diagonal channel, just a page torn from the classified section of the Derry News, but now George imagined it as a PT boat in a war movie, like the ones he sometimes saw down at the Derry Theater with Bill at Saturday matinees. A war picture with John Wayne fighting the Japs. The prow of the newspaper boat threw sprays of water to either side as it rushed along, and then it reached the gutter on the left side of Witcham Street. A fresh streamlet rushed over the break in the tar at this point, creating a fairly large whirlpool, and it seemed to him that the boat must be swamped and capsized. It leaned alarmingly, and then George cheered as it righted itself, turned, and went racing on down toward the intersection. George sprinted to catch up. Over his head, a grim gust of October wind rattled the trees, now almost completely unburdened of their freight of colored leaves by the storm, which had been this year a reaper of the most ruthless sort. Sitting up in bed, his cheeks still flushed with heat, but his fever, like the Kindeskeag, finally receding. Bill had finished the boat, but when George reached for it, Bill held it out of reach. "And now get me the PP paraffin." "What's that? Where is it?" "It's on the cellar shoe shelf as you go downstairs," Bill said. "In a box that says GUH Hulf. Gulf. Bring that to me, and a knife, and a bee-bowl, and a poo pack of mama matches." George had gone obediently to get these things. He could hear his mother playing the piano, not for Elise now, but something else he didn't like so well, something that sounded dry and fussy. He could hear rain flicking steadily against the kitchen windows. These were comfortable sounds, but the thought of the cellar was not a bit comfortable. He did not like the cellar, and he did not like going down the cellar stairs, because he always imagined there was something down there in the dark. That was silly, of course. His father said so, and his mother said so, and, even more important, Bill said so, but still. He did not even like opening the door to flick on the light, because he always had the idea. This was so exquisitely stupid, he didn't dare tell anyone. That while he was feeling for the light switch, some horrible clawed paw would settle lightly over his wrist, and then jerk him down into the darkness that smelled of dirt and wet and dim rotted vegetables. Stupid. There were no things with claws, all hairy and full of killing spite. Every now and then someone went crazy and killed a lot of people. Sometimes Chet Huntley told about such things on the evening news. And of course there were commies, but there was no weirdo monster living down in their cellar. Still, this idea lingered. In those interminable moments while he was groping for the switch with his right hand, his left arm curled around the door jamb in a death grip, that cellar smell seemed to intensify until it filled the world. Smells of dirt and wet and long-gone vegetables would merge into one unmistakable, ineluctable smell. The smell of the monster. The apotheosis of all monsters. That it was the smell of something for which he had no name. The smell of it, crouched and lurking and ready to spring. A creature which would eat anything, but which was especially hungry for boy meat. He had opened the door that morning and had groped interminably for the switch, holding the jam in his usual death grip, his eyes squinched shut, the tip of his tongue poked from the corner of his mouth like an agonized rootlet searching for water in a place of drought. Funny? Sure. You betcha. Look at you, Georgie. Georgie's scared of the dark. What a baby. The sound of the piano came from what his father called the living room and what his mother called the parlor. It sounded like music from another world, far away, the way talk and laughter on a summer-crowded beach must sound to an exhausted swimmer who struggles with the undertow. His fingers found the switch. Ah, they snapped it. And nothing. No light. Oh, cripes. The power. George snatched his arm back as if from a basket filled with snakes. He stepped back from the open cellar door, his heart hurrying in his chest. The power was out, of course. He had forgotten the power was out. Jeesley Crow. What now? Go back and tell Bill couldn't get the box of paraffin because the power was out and he was afraid that something might get him as he stood on the cellar stairs. Something that wasn't a commie or a mass murderer, but a creature much worse than either. That it would simply slither part of its rotted self up between the stair risers, and grab his ankle? That would go over big, wouldn't it? Others might laugh at such a fancy, but Bill wouldn't laugh. Bill would be mad. Bill would say, "Grow up, Georgie. Do you want this boat or not?" As if this thought were his cue, Bill called from his bedroom. Did he die out there, Georgie?" "No, I'm getting it, Bill," George called back at once. He rubbed at his arms, trying to make the guilty goose flesh disappear and be smooth skin again. "I just stepped to get a drink of water." "Well, hurry up." So he walked down the 4 steps to the cellar shelf, his heart a warm, beating hammer in his throat, the hair on the nape of his neck standing at attention, his eyes hot, his hands cold, sure that at any moment the cellar door would swing shut on its own, closing off the white light falling through the kitchen windows. And then he would hear it, something worse than all the commies and murderers in the world, worse than the Japs, worse than Attila the Hun, worse than the somethings in 100 horror movies. It, growling deeply. He would hear the growl in those lunatic seconds before it pounced on him and unzipped his guts. The cellar smell was worse than ever today because of the flood. Their house was high on Witcham Street, near the crest of the hill, and they had escaped the worst of it, but there was still standing water down there that had seeped in through the old rock foundations. The smell was low and unpleasant, making you want to take only the shallowest breaths. George sifted through the junk on the shelf as fast as he could. Old cans of Kiwi shoe polish and shoe polish rags, a broken kerosene lamp, 2 mostly empty bottles of Windex, an old flat can of turtle wax. For some reason, this struck him, and he spent nearly 30 seconds looking at the turtle on the lid with a kind of hypnotic wonder. Then he tossed it back. And here it was at last, a square box with the word GULF on it. George snatched it and ran up the stairs as fast as he could, suddenly aware that his shirt tail was out and suddenly sure that his shirt tail would be his undoing. The thing in the cellar would allow him to get almost all the way out, and then it would grab the tail of his shirt and snatch him back in. He reached the kitchen and swept the door shut behind him. It banged gustily. He leaned back against it with his eyes closed. Sweat popped out on his arms and forehead. The box of paraffin gripped tightly in one hand. The piano had come to a stop, and his mom's voice floated to him. "Georgie, can't you slam that door a little harder next time? Maybe you could break some of the plates in the Welsh dresser, if you really tried." "Sorry, Mom," he called back. "Georgie, you waste," Bill said from his bedroom. He pitched his voice low so their mother would not hear. George snickered a little. His fear was already gone. It had slipped away from him as easily as a nightmare slips away from a man who awakes, cold-skinned and gasping, from its grip, who feels his body and stares at his surroundings to make sure that none of it ever happened, and who then begins at once to forget it. Half is gone by the time his feet hit the floor, 3/4 of it by the time he emerges from the shower and begins to towel off. All of it by the time he finishes his breakfast. All gone. Until the next time, when, in the grip of the nightmare, all fears will be remembered. That turtle, George thought, going to the counter drawer where the matches were kept. Where did I see a turtle like that before? But no answer came, and he dismissed the question. He got a pack of matches from the drawer, a knife from the rack, holding the sharp edge studiously away from his body, as his dad had taught him, and a small bowl from the Welsh dresser in the dining room. Then he went back into Bill's room. What an a-hole you are, Georgie," Bill said, amiably enough, and pushed back some of the sick stuff on his nightable. An empty glass, a pitcher of water, Kleenex, books, a bottle of Vicks VapoRub, the smell of which Bill would associate all his life with thick, phlegmy chests and snotty noses. The old Philco radio was there, too, playing not Chopin or Bach, but a Little Richard tune. Very softly, however, so softly that Little Richard was robbed of all his raw and elemental power. Their mother, who had studied classical piano at Juilliard, hated rock and roll. She did not merely dislike it, she abominated it. "I'm no a-hole," George said, sitting on the edge of Bill's bed and putting the things he had gathered on the nightable. "Yes, you are," Bill said. "Nothing but a great big brown a-hole. That's you." George tried to imagine a kid who was nothing but a great big a-hole on legs and began to giggle. "Your a-hole is bigger than Augusta," Bill said, beginning to giggle too. "Your a-hole is bigger than the whole state," George replied. This broke both boys up for nearly 2 minutes. There followed a whispered conversation of the sort which means very little to anyone save small boys. Accusations of who was the biggest a-hole, who had the biggest a-hole, which a-hole was the brownest, and so on. Finally, Bill said one of the forbidden words. He accused George of being a big brown shitty-hole, and they both got laughing hard. Bill's laughter turned into a coughing fit. As it finally began to taper off, by then Bill's face had gone a plummy shade which George regarded with some alarm. The piano stopped again. They both looked in the direction of the parlor, listening for the piano bench to scrape back, listening for their mother's impatient footsteps. Bill buried his mouth in the crook of his elbow, stifling the last of the coughs, pointing at the pitcher at the same time. George poured him a glass of water, which he drank off. The piano began once more. Fur release again. Stuttering Bill never forgot that piece, and even many years later it never failed to bring goose flesh to his arms and back. His heart would drop, and he would remember. My mother was playing that the day Georgie died. You gonna cough anymore, Bill? No. Bill pulled a Kleenex from the box, made a rumbling sound in his chest, spat phlegm into the tissue, screwed it up, and tossed it into the wastebasket by his bed, which was filled with similar twists of tissue. Then he opened the box of paraffin and dropped a waxy cube of the stuff into his palm. George watched him closely, but without speaking or questioning. Bill didn't like George talking to him while he did stuff, but George had learned that if he just kept his mouth shut, Bill would usually explain what he was doing. Bill used the knife to cut off a small piece of the paraffin cube. He put the piece in the bowl, then struck a match and put it on top of the paraffin. The two boys watched the small yellow flame as the dying wind drove rain against the window in occasional spatters. Got to waterproof the boat, or it'll just get wet and sink, Bill said. When he was with George, his stutter was light. Sometimes he didn't stutter at all. In school, however, it could become so bad that talking became impossible for him. Communication would cease, and Bill's schoolmates would look somewhere else while Bill clutched the sides of his desk, his face growing almost as red as his hair, his eyes squeezed into slits as he tried to winch some word out of his stubborn throat. Sometimes, most times, the word would come. Other times it simply refused. He had been hit by a car when he was 3 and knocked into the side of a building. He had remained unconscious for 7 hours. Mom said it was that accident which had caused the stutter. George sometimes got the feeling that his dad, and Bill himself, was not so sure. The piece of paraffin in the bowl was almost entirely melted. The match flame guttered lower, growing blue as it hugged the cardboard stick, and then it went out. Bill dipped his finger into the liquid, jerked it out with a faint hiss. He smiled apologetically at George. Hot, he said. After a few seconds, he dipped his finger in again and began to smear the wax along the sides of the boat, where it quickly dried to a milky haze. Can I do some? George asked. Okay, just don't get any on the blankets or Mom will kill you. George dipped his finger into the paraffin, which was now very warm but no longer hot, and began to spread it along the other side of the boat. Don't put on so much, you a-hole, Bill said. You want to sink it on its maiden cruise? I'm sorry. That's all right. Just go easy. George finished the other side, then held the boat in his hands. It felt a little heavier, but not much. Too cool, he said. I'm going to go out and sail it. Yeah, you do that, Bill said. He suddenly looked tired and still not very well. I wish you could come, George said. He really did. Bill sometimes got bossy after a while, but he always had the coolest ideas and he hardly ever hit. It's your boat, really. She, Bill said. You call boats she. She then. I wish I could come too, Bill said glumly. Well, George shifted from one foot to the other, the boat in his hands. You put on your rain stuff, Bill said, or you'll wind up with the flu like me. Probably catch it anyway, from my Jew germs. Thanks, Bill. It's a neat boat. And he did something he hadn't done for a long time, something Bill never forgot. He leaned over and kissed his brother's cheek. You'll catch it for sure now, you a-hole, Bill said, but he seemed cheered up all the same. He smiled at George. Put all this stuff back, too, or Mom'll have a bee-bird. Sure. He gathered up the waterproofing equipment and crossed the room. The boat perched precariously on top of the paraffin box, which was sitting askew in the little bowl. Juju Georgie. George turned back to look at his brother. Be careful. Sure. His brow creased a little. That was something your mom said, not your big brother. It was as strange as him giving Bill a kiss. Sure I will. He went out. Bill never saw him again. 3. Now here he was, chasing his boat down the left side of Witcham Street. He was running fast, but the water was running faster, and his boat was pulling ahead. He heard a deepening roar and saw that 50 yards farther down the hill the water in the gutter was cascading into a storm drain that was still open. It was a long, dark semicircle cut into the curbing, and as George watched, a stripped branch, its bark as dark and glistening as sealskin, shot into the storm drain's maw. It hung up there for a moment and then slipped down inside. That was where his boat was headed. "Oh shit, and Shinola," he yelled, dismayed. He put on speed, and for a moment he thought he would catch the boat. Then one of his feet slipped and he went sprawling, skinning one knee and crying out in pain. From his new pavement-level perspective, he watched his boat swing around twice, momentarily caught in another whirlpool, and then disappear. "Shit and Shinola," he yelled again, and slammed his fist down on the pavement. That hurt too, and he began to cry a little. What a stupid way to lose the boat. He got up and walked over to the storm drain. He dropped to his knees and peered in. The water made a dank, hollow sound as it fell into the darkness. It was a spooky sound. It reminded him of. The sound was jerked out of him as if on a string, and he recoiled. There were yellow eyes in there. The sort of eyes he had always imagined but never actually seen down in the basement. It's an animal, he thought incoherently. That's all it is, some animal, maybe a house cat that got stuck down in there. Still, he was ready to run. Would run in a second or two, when his mental switchboard had dealt with the shock those two shiny yellow eyes had given him. He felt the rough surface of the macadam under his fingers and the thin sheet of cold water flowing around them. He saw himself getting up and backing away, and that was when a voice, a perfectly reasonable and rather pleasant voice, spoke to him from inside the storm drain. "Hi, Georgie," it said. George blinked and looked again. He could barely credit what he saw. It was like something from a made-up story or a movie where you know the animals will talk and dance. If he had been 10 years older, he would not have believed what he was seeing, but he was not 16. He was 6. There was a clown in the storm drain. The light in there was far from good, but it was good enough so that George Denbrough was sure of what he was seeing. It was a clown, like in the circus or on TV. In fact, he looked like a cross between Bozo and Clarabelle, who talked by honking his, or was it her? George was never really sure of the gender. Horn on Howdy Doody Saturday mornings. Buffalo Bob was just about the only one who could understand Clarabelle, and that always cracked George up. The face of the clown in the storm drain was white. There were funny tufts of red hair on either side of his bald head, and there was a big clown smile painted over his mouth. If George had been inhabiting a later year, he would have surely thought of Ronald McDonald before Bozo or Clarabelle. The clown held a bunch of balloons, all colors, like gorgeous ripe fruit, in one hand. In the other he held George's newspaper boat. "Want your boat, Georgie?" The clown smiled. George smiled back. He couldn't help it. It was the kind of smile you just had to answer. "I sure do," he said. The clown laughed. "I sure do. That's good. That's very good. And how about a balloon?" "Well, sure." He reached forward and then drew his hand reluctantly back. "I'm not supposed to take stuff from strangers. My dad said so." "Very wise of your dad," the clown in the storm drain said, smiling. "How?" George wondered. Could I have thought his eyes were yellow? They were a bright, dancing blue, the color of his mom's eyes and Bill's. "Very wise indeed. Therefore I will introduce myself. I, Georgie, am Mr. Bob Gray, also known as Pennywise the Dancing Clown. Pennywise, meet George Denbrough. George, meet Pennywise. And now we know each other. I'm not a stranger to you, and you're not a stranger to me." "Correct." George giggled. "I guess so." He reached forward again and drew his hand back again. "How did you get down there?" "Storm just blew me away," Pennywise the Dancing Clown said. "It blew the whole circus away." "Can you smell the circus, Georgie?" George leaned forward. Suddenly he could smell peanuts. Hot roasted peanuts. And vinegar. The white kind you put on your French fries through a hole in the cap. He could smell cotton candy and frying doughboys and the faint but thunderous odor of wild animal shit. He could smell the cheery aroma of Midway sawdust. And yet under it all was the smell of flood and decomposing leaves and dark storm drain shadows. That smell was wet and rotten. The cellar smell. But the other smells were stronger. "You bet I can smell it," he said. "Want your boat, Georgie?" Pennywise asked. "I only repeat myself because you really do not seem that eager." He held it up, smiling. He was wearing a baggy silk suit with great big orange buttons. A bright tie, electric blue, flopped down his front, and on his hands were big white gloves, like the kind Mickey Mouse and Donald Duck always wore. "Yes, sure," George said, looking into the storm drain. "And a balloon? I've got red and green and yellow and blue." "Do they float?" "Float?" The clown's grin widened. "Oh yes, indeed they do. They float. And there's cotton candy." George reached. The clown seized his arm, and George saw the clown's face change. What he saw then was terrible enough to make his worst imaginings of the thing in the cellar look like sweet dreams. What he saw destroyed his sanity in one clawing stroke. "They float," the thing in the drain crooned in a clotted, chuckling voice. It held George's arm in its thick and wormy grip. It pulled George toward that terrible darkness where the water rushed and roared and bellowed as it bore its cargo of storm debris toward the sea. George craned his neck away from that final blackness and began to scream into the rain, to scream mindlessly into the white autumn sky which curved above Derry on that day in the fall of 1957. His screams were shrill and piercing, and all up and down Witcham Street people came to their windows or bolted out onto their porches. "They float," it growled. "They float, Georgie, and when you're down here with me, you'll float, too." George's shoulders socked against the cement of the curb, and Dave Gardner, who had stayed home from his job at the shoe boat that day because of the flood, saw only a small boy in a yellow rain slicker. A small boy who was screaming and writhing in the gutter with muddy water surfing over his face and making his screams sound bubbly. "Everything down here floats," that chuckling, rotten voice whispered, and suddenly there was a ripping noise and a flaring sheet of agony, and George Denbrough knew no more. Dave Gardner was the first to get there, and although he arrived only 45 seconds after the first scream, George Denbrough was already dead. Gardner grabbed him by the back of the slicker, pulled him into the street, and began to scream himself as George's body turned over in his hands. The left side of George's slicker was now bright red. Blood flowed into the storm drain from the tattered hole where the left arm had been. A knob of bone, horribly bright, peeked through the torn cloth. The boy's eyes stared up into the white sky, and as Dave staggered away toward the others already running pell-mell down the street, they began to fill up with rain. Somewhere below, in the storm drain that was already filled nearly to capacity with runoff, there could have been no one down there. The county sheriff would later exclaim to a Derry news reporter with a frustrated fury so great it was almost agony. Hercules himself would have been swept away in that driving current. George's newspaper boat shot onward through night chambers and long concrete hallways that roared and chimed with water. For a while it ran neck and neck with a dead chicken that floated with its yellowy, reptilian toes pointed at the dripping ceiling. Then, at some junction east of town, the chicken was swept off to the left while George's boat went straight. An hour later, while George's mother was being sedated in the emergency room at Derry Home Hospital, and while stuttering Bill sat stunned and white and silent in his bed, listening to his father sob hoarsely in the parlor where his mother had been playing Fur Elise when George went out, the boat shot out through a concrete loophole like a bullet exiting the muzzle of a gun and ran at speed down a sluiceway and into an unnamed stream. When it joined the boiling, swollen Penobscot River 20 minutes later, the first rifts of blue had begun to show in the sky overhead. The storm was over. The boat dipped and swayed and sometimes took on water, but it did not sink. The two brothers had waterproofed it well. I do not know where it finally fetched up, if ever it did. Perhaps it reached the sea and sails there forever, like a magic boat in a fairy tale. All I know is that it was still afloat and still running on the breast of the flood when it passed the incorporated town limits of Derry, Maine, and there it passes out of this tale forever. The reason Adrian was wearing the hat, his sobbing boyfriend would later tell the police, was because he had won it at the pitch till you win stall on the Bassey Park Fairgrounds just 6 days before his death. He was proud of it. He was wearing it because he loved this shitty little town. The boyfriend, Don Haggerty, screamed at the cops. Now, there's no need for that sort of language," Officer Harold Gardner told Haggerty. Harold Gardner was one of Dave Gardner's 4 sons. On the day his father had discovered the lifeless, one-armed body of George Denbrough, Harold Gardner had been 5. On this day, almost 27 years later, he was 32 and balding. Harold Gardner recognized the reality of Don Haggerty's grief and pain, and at the same time, found it impossible to take seriously. This man, if you want to call him a man, was wearing lipstick and satin pants so tight you could almost read the wrinkles in his cock. Grief or no grief, pain or no pain, he was, after all, just a queer. Like his friend, the late Adrian Mellon. "Let's go through it again," Harold's partner, Jeffrey Reeves, said. "The two of you came out of the Falcon and turned toward the canal. Then what? How many times do I have to tell you idiots?" Haggerty was still screaming. "They killed him. They pushed him over the side. Just another day in Macho City for them." Don Haggerty began to cry. "One more time," Reeves repeated patiently. "You came out of the Falcon. Then what?" In an interrogation room just down the hall, two dairy cops were speaking with Steve Dubé, 17. In the clerk of probate's office upstairs, two more were questioning John Webby Garton, 18. And in the chief of police's office on the 5th floor, Chief Andrew Rademacher and Assistant District Attorney Tom Boutillier were questioning 15-year-old Christopher Onwin. Onwin, who wore faded jeans, a grease-smeared t-shirt, and blocky engineer boots, was weeping. Rademacher and Boutillier had taken him because they had quite accurately assessed him as the weak link in the chain. "Let's go through it again," Boutillier said in this office, just as Jeffrey Reeves was saying the same thing 2 floors down. "We didn't mean to kill him," Onwin blubbered. "It was the hat. We couldn't believe he was still wearing the hat after what Webby said the first time. And I guess we wanted to scare him." "For what he said?" Chief Rademacher interjected. "Yes. To John Garton, on the afternoon of the 17th. Yes, to Webby." Onwin burst into fresh tears. "But we tried to save him when we saw he was in trouble. At least me and Stevie Dubé did. We didn't mean to kill him. Come on, Chris, don't shit us," Boutillier said. "You threw the little queer into the canal." "Yes, but—" "And the three of you came in to make a clean breast of things. Chief Rademacher and I appreciate that, don't we, Andy?" "You bet. It takes a man to own up to what he did, Chris. So don't fuck yourself up by lying now. You meant to throw him over the minute you saw him and his fag buddy coming out of the Falcon, didn't you?" "No," Chris Onwin protested vehemently. Boutillier took a pack of Marlboros from his shirt pocket and stuck one in his mouth. He offered the pack to Onwin. "Cigarette." Onwin took one. Boutillier had to chase the tip with a match in order to give him a light because of the way Onwin's mouth was trembling. "But when you saw he was wearing the hat?" Rademacher asked. Onwin dragged deep, lowered his head so that his greasy hair fell in his eyes, and jetted smoke from his nose, which was littered with blackheads. "Yeah," he said, almost too softly to be heard. Boutillier leaned forward, brown eyes gleaming. His face was predatory, but his voice was gentle. "What, Chris?" I said yes. "I guess so. To throw him in. But not to kill him." He looked up at them, face frantic and miserable and still unable to comprehend the stupendous changes which had taken place in his life since he left the house to take in the last night of Derry's Canal Days festival with 2 of his buddies at 7:30 the previous evening. "Not to kill him," he repeated. "And that guy under the bridge." I still didn't know who he was. "What guy was that?" Rademacher asked, but without much interest. They had heard this part before as well, and neither of them believed it. Sooner or later, men accused of murder almost always drag out that mysterious other guy. Boutillier even had a name for it. He called it the one-armed man syndrome, after that old TV series The Fugitive. "The guy in the clown suit," Chris Onwin said, and shivered. "The guy with the balloons." The Canal Days Festival, which ran from July 15th to July 21st, had been a rousing success, most Derry residents agreed. A great thing for the city's morale, image, and pocketbook. The week-long festival was pegged to mark the centenary of the opening of the canal which ran through the middle of downtown. It had been the canal which had fully opened Derry to the lumber trade in the years 1884 to 1910. It had been the canal which had birthed Derry's boom years. The town was spruced up from east to west and north to south. Potholes which some residents swore hadn't been patched for 10 years or more were neatly filled with hot top and rolled smooth. The town buildings were refurbished on the inside, repainted on the outside. The worst of the graffiti in Bassey Park, much of it coolly logical anti-gay statements such as "kill all queers and AIDS from God, you hellbound homos," was sanded off the benches and wooden walls of the little covered walkway over the canal known as the Kissing Bridge. A Canal Days museum was installed in 3 empty storefronts downtown and filled with exhibits by Michael Hamlin, a local librarian and amateur historian. The town's oldest families loaned freely of their almost priceless treasures, and during the week of the festival, nearly 40,000 visitors paid a quarter each to look at eating house menus from the 1890s, loggers' bits, axes, and peavies from the 1880s, children's toys from the 1920s, and over 2,000 photographs and 9 reels of movie film of life, as it had been in Derry over the last 100 years. The museum was sponsored by the Derry Ladies' Society, which vetoed some of Hamlin's proposed exhibits, such as the notorious tramp chair from the 1930s, and photographs, such as those of the Bradley gang after the notorious shootout. But all agreed it was a great success, and no one really wanted to see those gory old things anyway. It was so much better to accentuate the positive and eliminate the negative, as the old song said. There was a huge striped refreshment tent in Derry Park, and band concerts there every night. In Bassey Park, there was a carnival with rides by Smokey's Greater Shows and games run by local townfolk. A special tram car circled the historic sections of the town every hour on the hour and ended up at this gaudy and amiable money machine. It was here that Adrian Mellon won the hat which would get him killed, the paper top hat with the flower, and the band which said Idery. "I'm tired," John Webby Garton said. Like his 2 friends, he was dressed in unconscious imitation of Bruce Springsteen. Although if asked, he would probably call Springsteen a wimp or a fagola, and would instead profess admiration for such bitchin' heavy metal groups as Def Leppard, Twisted Sister, or Judas Priest. The sleeves of his plain blue t-shirt were torn off, showing his heavily muscled arms. His thick brown hair fell over one eye. This touch was more John Cougar Mellencamp than Springsteen. There were blue tattoos on his arms, arcane symbols which looked as if they had been drawn by a child. "I don't want to talk no more. Just tell us about Tuesday afternoon at the fair," Paul Hughes said. Hughes was tired and shocked and dismayed by this whole sordid business. He thought again and again that it was as if Derry Canal Days ended with one final event which everyone had somehow known about, but which no one had quite dared to put down on the daily program of events. If they had, it would have looked like this. Saturday, 9 p.m., final band concert featuring the Derry High School Band and the Barber Shop Mellowmen. Saturday, 10 p.m., giant fireworks show. Saturday, 10:35 p.m., ritual sacrifice of Adrian Mellon officially ends Canal Days. "Fuck the fair," Webby replied. "Just what you said to Mellon and what he said to you." "Oh Christ." Webby rolled his eyes. "Come on, Webby," Hughes's partner said. Webby Garton rolled his eyes and began again. 5. Garton saw the 2 of them, Mellon and Haggerty, mincing along with their arms about each other's waists and giggling like a couple of girls. At first he actually thought they were a couple of girls. Then he recognized Mellon, who had been pointed out to him before. As he looked, he saw Mellon turn to Haggerty. And they kissed briefly. "Oh, man, I'm gonna barf," Webby cried, disgusted. Chris Onwin and Steve Dubé were with him. When Webby pointed out Mellon, Steve Dubé said he thought the other fag was named Don somebody, and that he'd picked up a kid from Derry High hitching and then tried to put a few moves on him. Mellon and Haggerty began to move toward the 3 boys again, walking away from the pitch till you win and toward the Carney's exit. Webby Garton would later tell officers Hughes and Conley that his civic pride had been wounded by seeing a fucking faggot wearing a hat which said Idery. It was a silly thing, that hat. A paper imitation of a top hat with a great big flower sticking up from the top and nodding about in every direction. The silliness of the hat apparently wounded Webby's civic pride even more. As Mellon and Haggerty passed, each with his arm linked about the other's waist, Webby Garton yelled out, "I ought to make you eat that hat, you fucking ass bandit." Mellon turned toward Garton, fluttered his eyes flirtatiously, and said, "If you want something to eat, hon, I can find something muck tastier than my hat." At this point Webby Garton decided he was going to rearrange the faggot's face. In the geography of Mellon's face, mountains would rise and continents would drift. Nobody suggested he sucked the root. Nobody. He started toward Mellon. Mellon's friend Haggerty, alarmed, attempted to pull Mellon away, but Mellon stood his ground, smiling. Garton would later tell officers Hughes and Conley that he was pretty sure Mellon was high on something to S.O. he was. Haggerty would agree when this idea was passed on to him by Officers Gardner and Reeves. He was high on 2 fried doughboys smeared with honey, on the carnival, on the whole day. He had been consequently unable to recognize the real menace which Webby Garton represented. But that was Adrian, Don said, using a tissue to wipe his eyes and smearing the spangled eyeshadow he was wearing. He didn't have much in the way of protective coloration. He was one of those fools who think things really are going to turn out all right. He might have been badly hurt there, and then if Garton hadn't felt something tap his elbow. It was a nightstick. He turned his head to see Officer Frank Mackin, another member of Derry's finest. "Never mind, little buddy," Mackin told Garton. "Mind your business and leave those little gay boyos alone. Have some fun." "Did you hear what he called me?" Garton asked hotly. He was now joined by Unwin and Dubé. The two of them, smelling trouble, tried to urge Garton on up the midway, but Garton shrugged them away, would have turned on them with his fists if they had persisted. His masculinity had borne an insult which he felt must be avenged. Nobody suggested he sucked the root. Nobody. "I don't believe he called you anything," Mackin replied. "And you spoke to him first, I believe. Now move on, Sonny. I don't want to have to tell you again." "He called me a queer. Are you worried you might be, then?" Mackin asked, seeming to be honestly interested, and Garton flushed a deep, ugly red. During this exchange, Haggerty was trying with increasing desperation to pull Adrian Mellon away from the scene. Now, at last, Mellon was going. "Ta-ta, love," Adrian called cheekily over his shoulder. "Shut up, candy ass," Mackin said. "Get out of here." Garton made a lunge at Mellon, and Mackin grabbed him. "I can run you in, my friend," Mackin said. "And the way you're acting, it might not be such a bad idea. Next time I see you, I'm gonna hurt you." Garton bellowed after the departing pair, and heads turned to stare at him. "And if you're wearing that hat, I'm gonna kill you. This town don't need no faggots like you." Without turning, Mellon waggled the fingers of his left hand. The nails were painted cerise, and put an extra little wiggle in his walk. Garton lunged again. "One more word, or one more move, and in you go," Mackin said mildly. "Trust me, my boy, for I mean exactly what I say." "Come on, Webby," Chris Onwin said uneasily. "Mellow out. You like guys like that?" Webby asked Mackin, ignoring Chris and Steve completely. "Huh. About the bum punchers, I'm neutral," Mackin said. "What I'm really in favor of is peace and quiet, and you are upsetting what I like, pizza face. Now do you want to go around with me or what?" "Come on, Webby," Steve Dubé said quietly. "Let's go get some hot dogs." Webby went, straightening his shirt with exaggerated moves and brushing the hair out of his eyes. Mackin, who also gave a statement on the morning following Adrian Mellon's death, said, "The last thing I heard him say as him and his buddies walked off was, 'Next time I see him, he's going to be in serious hurt.'" 6. "Please, I gotta talk to my mother," Steve Dubé said for the third time. "I've got to get her to mellow out my stepfather, or there is going to be one hell of a punching match when I get home." In a little while, Officer Charles Averino told him. Both Averino and his partner, Barney Morrison, knew that Steve Dubé would not be going home tonight, and maybe not for many nights to come. Theboe did not seem to realize just how heavy this particular bust was, and Averino would not be surprised when he learned, later on, that Dubé had left school at age 16. At that time, he had still been in Water Street Junior High. His IQ was 68, according to the Wexler he had taken during one of his 3 trips through the 7th grade. "Tell us what happened when you saw Mellon coming out of the Falcon," Morrison invited. "No, man, I better not." "Well, why not?" Averino asked. "I already talked too much, maybe." "You came in to talk," Averino said. "Isn't that right?" "Well, yeah. But..." "Listen," Morrison said warmly, sitting down next to Dubé and shooting him a cigarette. "You think me and Chick here like fags? I don't know. Do we look like we like fags? No, but..." "We're your friends, Steve-O," Morrison said solemnly. "And believe me, you and Chris and Webby need all the friends you can get just about now. Because tomorrow, every bleeding heart in this town is going to be screaming for you guys' blood." Steve Dubé looked dimly alarmed. Averino, who could almost read this hairbag's pussy little mind, suspected he was thinking about his stepfather again. And although Averino had no liking for Derry's small gay community, like every other cop on the force, he would enjoy seeing the Falcon shut up forever. He would have been delighted to drive Dubé home himself. He would, in fact, have been delighted to hold Dubé's arms while Dubé's stepfather beat the creep to oatmeal. Averino did not like gays, but this did not mean to believe they should be tortured and murdered. Melon had been savaged. When they brought him up from under the canal bridge, his eyes had been open, bulging with terror. And this guy here had absolutely no idea of what he had helped do. We didn't mean to hurt him, Steve repeated. This was his fallback position when he became even slightly confused. That's why you want to get out front with us? Averino said earnestly. Get the true facts of the matter out in front, and this maybe won't amount to a piss hole in the snow. Isn't that right, Barney? As Rain, Morrison agreed. One more time, what do you say? Averino coaxed. Well, Steve said, and then, slowly, began to talk. 7. When the Falcon was opened in 1973, Elmer Curdy thought his clientele would consist mostly off bus riders. The terminal next door serviced 3 different lines: Trailways, Greyhound, and Aroostook County. What he failed to realize was how many of the passengers who ride buses are women or families with small children in tow. Many of the others kept their bottles in brown bags and never got off the bus at all. Those who did were usually soldiers or sailors who wanted no more than a quick beer or 2. You couldn't very well go on a bender during a 10-minute rest stop. Curdy had begun to realize some of these home truths by 1977, but by then it was too late. He was up to his tits in bills, and there was no way that he could see out of the red ink. The idea of burning the place down for the insurance occurred to him, but unless he hired a professional to torch it, he supposed he would be caught. And he had no idea where professional arsonists hung out, anyway. He decided in February of that year that he would give it until July 4th. If things didn't look as if they were turning around by then, he would simply walk next door, get on Hound, and see how things looked down in Florida. But in the next 5 months, an amazing quiet sort of prosperity came to the bar, which was painted black and gold inside and decorated with stuffed birds. Elmer Curdy's brother had been an amateur taxidermist who specialized in birds, and Elmer had inherited the stuff when he died. Suddenly, instead of drawing 60 beers and pouring maybe 20 drinks a night, Elmer was drawing 80 beers and pouring 100 drinks. 120. Sometimes 160. His clientele was young, polite, almost exclusively male. Many of them dressed outrageously, but those were years when outrageous dress was still almost the norm, and Elmer Curdy did not realize that his patrons were just about almost exclusively gay until 1981 or so. If Derry residents had heard him say this, they would have laughed and said that Elmer Curdy must think they had all been born yesterday. But his claim was perfectly true. Like the man with the cheating wife, he was practically the last to know. And by the time he didn't care. The bar was making money, and while there were 4 other bars in Derry which turned a profit, the Falcon was the only one where rambunctious patrons did not regularly demolish the whole place. There were no women to fight over, for one thing, and these men, fags or not, seemed to have learned a secret of getting along with each other which their heterosexual counterparts did not know. Once he became aware of the sexual preference of his regulars, he seemed to hear lurid stories about the Falcon everywhere. These stories had been circulating for years, but until 81 Curdy simply hadn't heard them. The most enthusiastic tellers of these tales, he came to realize, were men who wouldn't be dragged into the Falcon with a chain fall for fear all the muscles would go out of their wrists, or something. Yet they seemed privy to all sorts of information. According to the stories, you could go in there any night and see men close dancing, rubbing their cocks together right out on the dance floor, men French kissing at the bar, men getting blowjobs in the bathrooms. There was supposedly a room out back where you went if you wanted to spend a little time on the Tower of Power. There was a big old fellow in a Nazi uniform back there who kept his arm greased most of the way to the shoulder and who would be happy to take care of you. In fact, none of these things were true. When folks with a thirst did come in from the bus station for a beer or a highball, they sensed nothing out of the ordinary in the Falcon at all. There were a lot of guys, sure, but that was no different than thousands of workingmen's bars all across the country. The clientele was gay, but gay was not a synonym for stupid. If they wanted a little outrageousness, they went to Portland. If they wanted a lot of outrageousness, Ramrod-style outrageousness or Peck's big boy-style outrageousness, they went down to New York or Boston. Derry was small, Derry was provincial, and Derry's small gay community understood the shadow under which it existed quite well. Don Haggerty had been coming into the Falcon for 2 or 3 years on the night in March of 1984 when he first showed up with Adrian Mellon. Before then, Haggerty had been the sort who plays the field, rarely showing up with the same escort half a dozen times. But by late April it had become obvious even to Elmer Curdy, who cared very little about such things, that Haggerty and Mellon had a steady thing going. Haggerty was a draftsman with an engineering firm in Bangor. Adrian Mellon was a freelance writer who published anywhere and everywhere he could: airline magazines, confession magazines, regional magazines, Sunday supplements, sex letter magazines. He had been working on a novel, but maybe that wasn't serious. He had been working on it since his third year of college, and that had been 12 years ago. He had come to Derry to write a piece about the canal. He was on assignment from New England Byways, a glossy bi-monthly that was published in Concord. Adrian Mellon had taken the assignment because he could squeeze Byways for 3 weeks' worth of expense money, including a nice room at the Derry townhouse, and gather all the material he needed for the piece in maybe 5 days. During the other 2 weeks, he could gather enough material for maybe 4 other regional pieces. But during that 3-week period, he met Don Haggerty, and instead of going back to Portland when his 3 weeks on the cuff were over, he found himself a small apartment on Kossuth Lane. He lived there for only 6 weeks. Then he moved in with Don Haggerty. 8. That summer, Haggerty told Harold Gardner and Jeff Reeves, was the happiest summer of his life. He should have been on the lookout, he said. He should have known that God only puts a rug under guys like him in order to jerk it out from under their feet. The only shadow, he said, was Adrian's extravagantly partisan reaction to Derry. He had a t-shirt which said Maine ain't bad, but Derry's great. He had a Derry Tigers high school jacket. And of course there was the hat. He claimed to find the atmosphere vital and creatively invigorating. Perhaps there was something to this. He had taken his languishing novel out of the trunk for the first time in nearly a year. Was he really working on it then? Gardner asked Haggerty, not really caring but wanting to keep Haggerty primed. Yes, he was busting pages. He said it might be a terrible novel, but it was no longer going to be a terrible unfinished novel. He expected to finish it by his birthday, in October. Of course, he didn't know what Derry was really like. He thought he did, but he hadn't been here long enough to get a whiff of the real Derry. I kept trying to tell him, but he wouldn't listen. And what's Derry really like, Don? Reeves asked. It's a lot like a dead strumpet with maggots squirming out of her cuz, Don Haggerty said. The two cops stared in silent amazement. It's a bad place, Haggerty said. It's a sewer. You mean you two guys don't know that? You two guys have lived here all of your lives, and you don't know that? Neither of them answered. After a little while, Haggerty went on. Until Adrian Mellon entered his life, Don had been planning to leave Derry. He had been there for 3 years, mostly because he had agreed to a long-term lease on an apartment with the world's most fantastic river view. But now the lease was almost up and Don was glad. No more long commute back and forth to Bangor. No more weird vibes. In Derry, he once told Adrian, it always felt like 13 o'clock. Adrian might think Derry was a great place, but it scared Don. It was not just the town's tightly homophobic attitude, an attitude as clearly expressed by the town's preachers as by the graffiti in Bassey Park, but that was one thing he had been able to put his finger on. Adrian had laughed. Don, every town in America has a contingent that hates the gay folk, he said. Don't tell me you don't know that. This is, after all, the era of Ronnie Moron and Phyllis Housefly. Come down to Bassey Park with me, Don had replied, after seeing that Adrian really meant what he was saying. And what he was really saying was that Derry was no worse than any other fair-sized town in the hinterlands. I want to show you something, my love. They drove to Bassey Park. This had been in mid-June, about a month before Adrian's murder, Haggerty told the cops. He took Adrian into the dark, vaguely unpleasant-smelling shadows of the Kissing Bridge. He pointed out one of the graffiti. Adrian had to strike a match and hold it below the writing in order to read it. Show me your cock, queer, and I'll cut it off you. I know how people feel about gays, Don said quietly. I got beaten up at a truck stop in Dayton when I was a teenager. Some fellows in Portland set my shoes on fire outside of a sandwich shop, while this fat-assed old cop sat inside his cruiser and laughed. I've seen a lot. But I've never seen anything quite like this. Look over here. Check it out. Another match revealed stick nails and eyes of all faggots. For God. Whoever writes these little homilies has got a case of the deep-down crazies. I'd feel better if I thought it was just one person, one isolated sickie, But Don swept his arm vaguely down the length of the kissing bridge. There's a lot of this stuff. And I just don't think one person did it all. That's why I want to leave Derry, Ade. Too many places and too many people seem to have the deep-down crazies. Well, wait until I finish my novel, okay? Please. October, I promise, no later. The air's better here. He didn't know it was the water he was going to have to watch out for, Don Haggerty said bitterly. Tom Boutillier and Chief Rademacher leaned forward, neither of them speaking. Chris Onwin sat with his head down, talking monotonously to the floor. This was the part they wanted to hear. This was the part that was going to send at least 2 of these assholes to Thomaston. The fare wasn't no good, Onwin said. They was already talking down all the bitchin' rides, you know, like the Devil Dish and the Parachute Drop. They already had a sign on the bumper cars that said closed. Wasn't nothing open but baby rides. So we went down by the games, and Webby saw the pitch till you win, and he paid 50 cents and he seen that hat the queer was wearing and he pitched at that. But he kept missing it. And every time he missed he got more in a bad mood. You know? And Steve, he's the guy who usually goes around saying mellow out. Like mellow out this and mellow out that. And why don't you fucking mellow out, you know? Only he was in a real piss-up-a-rope mood because he took this pill, you know? I don't know what kind of a pill. A red pill. Maybe it was even legal. But he keeps after Webby until I thought Webby was going to hit him, you know. He goes, you can't even win that queer's hat. You must be really wasted if you can't even win that queer's HATSO. Finally the lady gives him a prize, even though the ring wasn't over it. 'Cause I think she wanted to get rid of us. I don't know. Maybe she didn't. But I think she did. It was this noisemaker thing, you know? You blow it, and it puffs up and unrolls and makes a noise like a fart, you know? I used to have one of those. I got it for Halloween or New Year's or some fucking holiday. I thought it was pretty good. Only I lost it. Or maybe somebody hawked it out of my pocket in the fucking play yard at school, you know? So then the fair's closing, and we're walking out and Steve's still on Webby about not being able to win that queer's hat, you know? And Webby ain't saying much, and I know that's a bad sign, but I was pretty faced, you know? So I knew I ought to like change the subject, only I couldn't think of no subject, you know? So when we get into the parking lot, Steve says, where you want to go? Home. And Webby goes, let's cruise by the Falcon first and see if that queer's around. Boutillier and Rademacher exchanged a glance. Boutillier raised a single finger and tapped it against his cheek. Although this doofus in the engineer boots didn't know it, he was now talking about first-degree murder. So I goes, no, I gotta get home. And Webby goes, you scared to go by that queer bar? And I go, fuck no. And Steve's still high or something. And he says, let's go grease some queer meat. Let's go grease some queer meat. Let's go grease. The timing was just right enough so that things worked out wrong for everyone. Adrian Mellon and Don Haggerty came out of the Falcon after 2 beers, walked up past the bus station, and then linked hands. Neither of them thought about it. It was just something they did. It was 10:20. They reached the corner and turned left. The Kissing Bridge was almost half a mile upriver from here. They meant to cross Main Street Bridge, which was much less picturesque. The Kindeskeg was summer low, no more than 4 feet of water sliding listlessly around the concrete pilings. When the duster drew abreast of them, Steve Dubé had spotted the 2 of them coming out of the Falcon and gleefully pointed them out. They were on the edge of the span. Cut in. Cut in. Webby Garton screamed. The 2 men had just passed under a streetlight, and he had spotted the fact that they were holding hands. This infuriated him. But not as much as the hat infuriated him. The big paper flower was nodding crazily this way and that. Cut in, goddammit. And Steve did. Chris Onwin would deny active participation in what followed, but Don Haggerty told a different story. He said that Garton was out of the car almost before it stopped, and that the other 2 quickly followed. There was talk. Not good talk. There was no attempt at flippancy or false coquetry on Adrian's part this night. He recognized that they were in a lot of trouble. Give me that hat, Garton said. Give it to me, queer. If I do, will you leave us alone? Adrian was wheezing with fright, almost crying, looking from Onwin to Dubé to Garton with terrified eyes. Just give me the fucker. Adrian handed it over. Garton produced a switch knife from the left front pocket off his jeans and cut it into 2 pieces. He rubbed the pieces against the seat of his jeans. Then he dropped them to his feet and stomped them. Don Haggerty backed away a little while their attention was divided between Adrian and the hat. He was looking, he said, for a cop. Now will you let us out? Adrian Mellon began. And that was when Garton punched him in the face, driving him back against the waist-high pedestrian railing of the bridge. Adrian screamed, clapping his hands to his mouth. Blood poured through his fingers. "Ade!" Haggerty cried, and ran forward again. Dubé tripped him. Garton booted him in the stomach, knocking him off the sidewalk and into the roadway. A car passed. Haggerty rose to his knees and screamed at it. It didn't slow. The driver, he told Gardner and Reeves, never even looked around. "Shut up, queer," Dubé said, and kicked him in the side of the face. Haggerty fell on his side in the gutter, semi-conscious. A few moments later he heard a voice, Chris Onwin's, telling him to get away before he got what his friend was getting. In his own statement, Onwin verified giving this warning. Haggerty could hear thudding blows and the sound of his lover screaming. Adrian sounded like a rabbit in a snare, he told the police. Haggerty crawled back toward the intersection and the bright lights of the bus station, and when he was a distance away, he turned back to look. Adrian Mellon, who stood about 5'5" and might have weighed 135 pounds soaking wet, was being pushed from Garton to Dubé to Onwin in a kind of triple play. His body jittered and flopped like the body of a rag doll. They were punching him, pummeling him, ripping at his clothes. As he watched, he said, Garton punched Adrian in the crotch. Adrian's hair hung in his face. Blood poured out of his mouth and soaked his shirt. Webby Garton wore 2 heavy rings on his right hand. One was a Derry High School ring. The other one he had made in shop class. An intertwined brass DB stood out 3 inches from this latter. The letters stood for the Dead Bugs, a metal band he particularly admired. The rings had torn Adrian's upper lip open and shattered 3 of his upper teeth at the gum line. "Help!" Haggerty shrieked. "Help! Help! They're killing him! Help!" The buildings of Main Street loomed dark and secret. No one came to help, not even from the one white island-off light which marked the bus station, and Haggerty did not see how that could be. There were people in there. He had seen them when he and Ade walked past. Would none of them come to help? None at all. "Help! Help! They're killing him! Help! Please, for God's sake! Help!" A very small voice whispered from Don Haggerty's left. And then there was a giggle. Bums rush. Garton was yelling now. Yelling and laughing. All 3 of them, Haggerty told Gardner and Reeves, had been laughing while they beat Adrian up. Bums rush. Over the side. Bums rush. Bums rush. Bums rush. Dubé chanted, laughing. "Help!" the small voice said again. And although the voice was grave, that little giggle followed again. It was like the voice of a child who cannot help itself. Haggerty looked down and saw the clown, and it was at this point that Gardner and Reeves began to discount everything that Haggerty said, because the rest was the raving of a lunatic. Later, however, Harold Gardner found himself wondering. Later, when he found that the Onwin boy had also seen a clown, or said he had, he began to have second thoughts. His partner either never had them or would never admit to them. The clown, Haggerty said, looked like a cross between Ronald McDonald and that old TV clown, Bozo, or so he thought at first. It was the wild tufts of orange hair that brought such comparisons to mind. But later consideration had caused him to think the clown really looked like neither. The smile painted over the white pancake was red, not orange, and the eyes were a weird shiny silver. Contact lenses, perhaps. But a part of him thought then, and continued to think, that maybe that silver had been the real color of those eyes. He wore a baggy suit with big orange pom-pom buttons. On his hands were cartoon gloves. "If you need help, Don," the clown said, "help yourself to a balloon." And it offered the bunch it held in one hand. "They float," the clown said. "Down here we all float. Pretty soon your friend will float, too." 12. "This clown called you by name," Jeff Reeves said in a totally expressionless voice. He looked over Haggerty's bent head at Harold Gardner, and one eye drew down in a wink. "Yes," Haggerty said, not looking up. "I know how it sounds." 13. "So then you threw him over," Boutilier said. "Bums rush." "Not me," Onwin said, looking up. He flicked the hair out of his eyes with one hand and stared at them urgently. "When I saw they really meant to do it, I tried to pull Steve away because I knew the guy might get banged up. It was like 10 feet to the water." It was 23. One of Chief Rademacher's patrolmen had already measured. But it was like he was crazy. The 2 of them kept yelling, "Bums rush. Bums rush," and they picked him up. Webby had him under the arms and Steve had him by the seat of the pants. And 14. When Haggerty saw what they were doing, he rushed back toward them, screaming no, 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 at the top of his voice. Chris Onwin pushed him backward and Haggerty landed in a teeth-rattling heap on the sidewalk. Do you want to go over, too? He whispered. You run, baby. They threw Adrian Mellon over the bridge and into the water then. Haggerty heard the splash. Let's get out of here, Steve Dubé said. He and Webby were backing toward the car. Chris Onwin went to the railing and looked over. He saw Haggerty first, sliding and clawing his way down the weedy, trash-littered embankment to the water. Then he saw the clown. The clown was dragging Adrian out on the far side with one arm. Its balloons were in its other hand. Adrian was dripping wet, choking, moaning. The clown twisted its head and grinned up at Chris. Chris said he saw its shining silver eyes and its bared teeth. Great big teeth, he said. Like the lion in the circus, man, he said. I mean, they were that big. Then, he said, he saw the clown shove one of Adrian Mellon's arms back, so it lay over his head. Then what, Chris? Boutilier said. He was bored with this part. Fairy tales had bored him since the age of 8 on. I dunno, Chris said. That was when Steve grabbed me and hauled me into the car. But I think it bit into his armpit. He looked up at them again, uncertain now. I think that's what it did. Bit into his armpit. Like it wanted to eat him, man. Like it wanted to eat his heart. 15. No, Haggerty said when he was presented with Chris Onwin's story in the form of questions. The clown did not drag Ade up on the far bank, at least not that he saw, and he would grant that he had been something less than a disinterested observer by that point. By that point, he had been out of his fucking mind. The clown, he said, was standing near the far bank with Adrian's dripping body clutched in its arms. Christopher Philip Onwin was tried separately as a juvenile and convicted of second-degree manslaughter. He was sentenced to 6 months at the South Wyndham Boys Training Facility, sentence suspended. At the time of this writing, all 3 sentences are under appeal. Garton and Dubé may be seen on any given day girl watching or playing penny pitch in Bassey Park, not far from where Mellon's torn body was found floating against one of the pilings of the Main Street Bridge. Don Haggerty and Chris Onwin have left town. At the major trial, that of Garton and Dubé, no one mentioned a clown.